Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined by two great guests. They are Amy Toth, professor in ecology, evolution, and organismal biology at Iowa State University, and Matt O'Neill, a Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture and professor in the Plant Pathology, Entomology, and Microbiology Department, also at Iowa State University. They were here to discuss their article from BioScience's forthcoming special issue on One Health, and it's entitled, Can Native Vegetation in Agroecosystems Provide a Net Benefit for Pollinators Despite Pesticide Use? I'll let them tell you all about it. Let's go to the interview. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great to be here, James.
Thanks, James.
Okay, so I thought to get us started, it probably makes sense to start general. And I was wondering if you could just introduce our listeners who are not familiar with the concept to the idea of a prairie strip and what exactly that is and what it could mean.
Yeah, sure. I can start. So imagine a vast landscape in which most of the land is covered in very productive crops, corn and soybeans, in the particular case of prairie strips, which we'll be talking mostly about today. And imagine small little linear patches of prairie that are either on the edges of these large corn and soybean fields or embedded within them. Usually multiple strips, but usually occupying 10% of that field. So mostly corn and soybean with small patches of prairie. And so those prairies in the midsummer would be consisting of various grasses and flowering forbs, a lot of native plants, including a lot of flowering vegetation. So you'd see lots of colors, lots of different species blooming in the middle of the season. So that's sort of a picture description, and Matt can elaborate on maybe some of the more technical aspects.
Yeah, so a prairie strip is also a conservation practice that is supported by the USDA's Conservation Reserve Program. It's numbered CP43, and it was brought into the CRP program in the last Farm Bill in 2018. So now it's a conservation practice that landowners who would like to take a little bit of land out of production and put into these prairie strips can get support to do that, to compensate them for the loss of income that comes from taking that productive land out of agricultural use. And then kind of reflecting the bigger picture, by taking that land out of production and somewhat strategically placing it in strips that run parallel to the contours of the field, that landowner is placing a barrier to the loss of sediment and nutrients that move off of those crop fields that then enter into the watershed. So a prairie strip is a physical barrier that can capture the sediment and nutrients and keep that in the field, helping the overall watershed health, but also the health of that field. And then Amy and I are both entomologists, and we got excited about the flowering resources that can be available in those prairie strips for a variety of insects that need that perennial native habitat to survive.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I'm wondering now, this is something I've wondered in the past. Prairie strips, are they in strips rather than, little isolated sort of zones within? Is that primarily for the prevention of sediment runoff and that sort of thing?
Yes.
You're both nodding enthusiastically.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great visuals for an audio setting. Yeah, so the prairie strip practice was developed by a multidisciplinary team at Iowa State University who initially set out to solve this issue of the movement of sediment and the nutrients that are added to fields that end up moving through watersheds and contributing to things like anoxic zones at the base of those watersheds. And the hypothesis at the start was, hey, if we took a little bit of land out of production, could we see huge improvements in some environmental issues? So a little bit of cost, but great benefit after those prairie strips established. And yeah, so it's a little bit different than, say, CP42, another USDA Conservation Reserve Program practice that is just pollinator habitat that can go anywhere. This practice of prairie strips has a little bit of a prescription that it be applied at the base or in these strips up to 7 to 10% of the land. so that it can act as that barrier in the field.
Yeah, and I think that brings up the important distinction that the motivation for prairie strips is usually not the primary motivation is pollinators specifically. The primary motivation is other environmental and agronomic concerns, and that it is a voluntary program that farmers commit to, usually because of their concerns with soil erosion, water quality. But, the bonus of providing wildlife habitat and helping pollinators is motivating to farmers as well.
That's been something that is really remarkable in our neck of the woods, because as Amy pointed out, most of the prairie strips that we've been working with in Iowa are embedded in corn and soybean fields. These are two crops that do not need insect pollination for yield. Corn is a grass, it produces pollen, but it's wind pollinated. Soybeans produce these perfect flowers that are self-pollinated. There's some evidence that there may be a benefit in improving yield if they get visited by bees and other insects, but it's not something that our soybean farmers manage for. They don't bring honeybees out to those fields. So in this landscape, farmers and landowners have indicated that, they want the benefit that comes with the prairie strips being a refuge, a resource for bees, even though that's not part of their agricultural practice.
Yeah, that's been interesting too, because there is concern from obviously the public and environmentalists about the use of pesticides in agricultural landscapes and their impacts on non-target insects, especially pollinators. And so a lot of farmers are using pesticides in their operations, and they don't necessarily want to be harming these non-target insects, these beneficial insects. And so in some ways, this is an opportunity for them to offset some of the possible negative impacts of their operations on beneficial species such as pollinators.
And just out of curiosity, is that motivation to offset those impacts, is that largely just a sort of an intrinsic value that they happen to hold, or is there a financial motivation, or kind of what drives that?
Yeah, I would say intrinsic value is important. We've also seen a great interest in apiculture and using prairie strips as locations for apiary and honey production. Usually that honey production is not directly tied to the farming operation. It's usually in collaboration with a beekeeper. So that would be, again, not really a financial motivation, but they like producing honey on their land and being able to have an opportunity to taste that honey, share that honey, get some kind of added benefit from their land, from the presence of honeybees.
Yeah, I would say that the intrinsic value is at the forefront of this, in part because the practice, yes, it delivers on improving the abundance and diversity of native bees and improving honeybee productivity in our landscape, but the landowners and farmers that are making the decision to put prairie strips in are not beekeepers. And typically in our part of the world, beekeepers do not own land. So the incentive for prairie strips is not primarily to improve productivity, but to have an environmental improvement for their entire, for their watershed, for their field. And it's been interesting. We've had colleagues in sociology, like Dr. J. Arbuckle, survey the public and landowners who have used prairie strips, and they notice and they and say that prairie strips as a pollinator conservation practice is a motivator for them. Again, even though the land, the farming that they're doing is not benefiting from insect pollination, and they themselves are not beekeepers.
Yeah, and we've had farmers tell us what a joy it is to go out to their fields and see it brimming with life, buzzing, butterflies flying around. And a lot of them say, oh, it's like my childhood, seeing all this activity, these organisms, lots of different species. And that's something that they wouldn't typically see concentrated in such a small area in a typical corn or soybean farm. So it is almost this intrinsic or even aesthetic value that we're seeing that, again, is kind of a bonus in addition to the original intention of these prairie strips.
That's incredibly cool. And I'm wondering about what it's like in the absence of a prairie strip on, one of these soybean farms. I'm imagining that, given the presence of pesticides and the, sort of the monoculture nature of the fields, you're probably not looking at a great habitat for, particularly wild native pollinators and that type of organism.
It's all relative.
Okay.
So yes, relative to a prairie, there is less diversity and abundance, but Matt has done some studies on this, and there are pollinators out there in corn and soybean fields.
Yeah, to give you some perspective, 84 to 87% of all of Iowa is committed to agriculture, and 70% of that is corn and soybeans. So corn and soybeans are both annual plants, and when they're not present, the ground is bare, more or less. We have some increase in cover crops, but it's a small percentage of the total land that's used for agriculture. So about 8 months out of the year, that ground is bare. And soybeans and corn, they produce flowers to some extent, but it's for a short window. And Amy and I collaborated on a project a few years ago, maybe several years ago. Who's doing the math? Where we kept honeybees at soybean farms, independent of prairie strips, independent of prairies, and just asked, how are the bees responding to that landscape? And what we found was, honeybees will produce a honey crop in those fields, but after the soybeans stop flowering, they start losing weight. Not the individual bees, but the colonies, because they're consuming the honey that they have produced up until August, because there's nothing else for them to forage on. And if you're eating your honey in August, there's going to be very little for you come the winter. And honeybees aren't native, but they do give us some insight into what native bees must be facing in that landscape. And Amy pointed out that we've done some surveys, this is going back almost 10 years ago, of corn and soybean fields, looking at what the native pollinator bee community looks like. It's kind of shocking. There's 40 to 50 species of bees in those fields. Somehow they're making a go of it. It's probably a combination of using whatever resources they can find in those fields, but also at field edges. And we have a lot of roadsides and things called grassed waterways that farmers put in to help move water off the field. And there are some resources there. But our colleagues, Mary Harris, Matt Lieben, Fernandez Cordobaque, have shown that there's a huge improvement when you put the prairie strips into the fields over what other non-crop habitat may be there.
Yeah, and one of my students, just to riff off of that a little bit, one of my students, Kate Borchardt, did some work to look at the interactions between bees and plants, either in these field edges, which typically consist of, they're more grassy, and then they usually have more exotic or weedy flowering plants, which are good for some species of bees, but not necessarily all, and compared that to prairie strips. And you just see way more interactions happening in prairie strips. So there's more bee species present, more plant species present, and then more complex interrelationships between them. And that is something that we like to see in ecological systems, because that tells us that they can be more robust to change, more dynamic, more resilient. And so we do see just a lot more biodiversity and a lot more ecological interactions happening in a prairie strip as opposed to one of these field margins.
Okay, so this is the case, in which if you're primarily reliant on field margins and you're reliant on, the crop systems, the pollinators will essentially be subject to a nutritional crash as you get toward the end of, the harvesting season in August, because you've just removed most of the, potential sources of food for them. And, then they've got to make it through what we were talking about before we started, a very chilly winter without any resources, either in terms of, additional body fat for many of the native pollinators or honey, if we're talking about apiaries.
Exactly. And that brings up another issue that we found is really important, is the availability of floral resources over time across the season. And yes, a soybean field, for example, has many flowers, but for a very short period of time. And there are a decent number of bee species that'll utilize the nectar that's being produced from these soybeans. But then when they cease blooming, that actually coincides with when a lot of these exotic or invasive plants cease blooming, a lot of things like clover that you might see in a field edge. And then all of a sudden, this landscape has almost nothing to eat for pollinators. And we see symptoms of that with our honeybee colonies. They start, they sort of crash and burn around early August when they have gotten really large, produced a lot of honey, and then all of a sudden there's hardly anything to eat. They'll start robbing each other's honey stores. And so usually this is when beekeepers would go in and feed them with either sugar or corn syrup because there's just nothing to eat. And but that same landscape is where these native pollinators are also trying to eke out an existence and find something to eat. And there are a lot of species that are still very active into September and October. And there's very little on the landscape, as opposed to a prairie system in which you have plants that are blooming throughout the entire season. A lot of the native prairie plants bloom well into early fall. And so just spreading out those floral resources more evenly across the season seems to be something that is really important and that agricultural systems are not providing.
That's interesting. And one question I had is just about, the study of this sort of thing. Do we tend to talk about honeybees in these systems because they're an easy organism to kind of measure the health of, versus looking for instance, some ground nesting solitary bee that I'm imagining, knowing nothing about them, is not as easy to look at and examine and measure their health?
Yes, absolutely. So our intention has been to try to study both managed bees and wild bees and other pollinators, and some work on monarch butterflies as well. A lot of people are concerned about various different species. In Iowa, we actually have some threatened and endangered pollinator species, including the monarch butterfly and also the rusty-patched bumblebee, which is a federally protected species under the Endangered Species Act. And we've been doing some work on those. And in fact, one of our students even found one in a prairie strip. And so these prairie strips are potentially providing habitat for a lot of wild species, including some of these of conservation concern. Yes, the problem, though, is a lot of these bees are hard to find, hard to study. Their nesting habits are very cryptic. So a lot of them nest in the ground. How do you find them? You get lucky sometimes, and you'll find nests or aggregations. A few of them nest in structures that we can place out and study. But overall, they're much, much harder to study, especially if you're trying to track reproduction, survival, things that take long periods of time to study. So it's actually relatively easy logistically to go out into a field and watch pollinators on flowers. And so we've done a lot of that. And so we can count them, we can determine that they're present, but then actually studying something like reproduction or survival, honeybees are very useful because we can go back to those hives day after day and take very detailed measurements on their health. So honeybees can be useful in that way. Of course, there are many differences between the biology of a honeybee and the biology of a lot of wild bee species. And so they're not a perfect, by any means, substitute for studies on wild bees. So our attempt has been to try to study both in these systems. And we do see some similarities in their responses, but then also some differences.
And I might just add that, yeah, you're right. Honeybees can be a model system for studying how just a bee responds to floral resources in light of the difficulty of studying ground nesting bees and others. But honeybees are also a form of agriculture in beekeeping. And even though Iowa is a state dominated by corn and soybeans, we're 14th in honey production. We have a modest community of beekeepers who are somehow able to make use of that landscape. And what we found, and this is reflected in the paper, that honeybee productivity is improved upon when prairie strips are present in a field. And so taking a step away from sort of the basic science, what I think we're showing with the prairie strips is, yeah, you take a little land out of production, and that does affect the bottom line for the farmer who's growing corn and soybeans, but it is improving upon another form of agriculture, and that's the beekeeping. Now, there's some tension about conservation practices who are in part there to improve native bees and that are threatened, and showing how that could improve a form of agriculture that involves some competition between the native bees and the honeybees. But several students have shown that there seems to be some partitioning of the resources that are in prairie strips, but between these two groups of bees. That floral resource in the prairie strips we don't see it being used by honeybees when the soybeans are flowering and the clover is flowering. But we do see that being used throughout the season by the native bees. The competition, the overlap occurs mostly in August and September when those mass flowering crops are no longer blooming, and now that honeybee colony is looking for somewhere to feed.
Oh, that's an interesting feature of this system, in that you have a situation in which the honeybees are able to draw heavily from your large crop system, and then reduce competition on the floral resources within the prairie strips, because that was one of the interesting findings for me in reading the article, is that there wasn't as vigorous competition between the wild bees and the managed bees, at least for part of the year, which that was interesting and a surprise to me.
Yeah, and we've attempted to study the interactions between honeybees and wild bees in several studies, one of which was in prairie strips, and we're not finding any immediate negative impacts of honeybees on wild bee populations, like abundances in the same areas, and the number of species, for example, that co-occur with honeybees. So that's positive. And it could be this resource partitioning. We do need to look more into the late season period, which for various reasons is somewhat difficult to study. And so I think more work is needed in that area. But at least for now, it is like somewhat hopeful that there's not immediate negative impacts. One study that was not in prairie strips looked at the impact of the surrounding landscape, whether there was other habitat features such as forest and grassland, and found that there's a much stronger impact of landscape on wild bee communities than the presence of honeybees. In other words, in some landscapes, they have bigger problems than honeybees in terms of trying to eke out their survival. So there is some potential for coexistence, although again, I think we still need some further studies.
Okay, so I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the concept of an ecological trap, and the idea that something like this could potentially, doesn't seem to be shaking out that way, but I wonder about prairie strips as an appealing source of resources for pollinators, but how do we ensure that it doesn't become a situation in which they're drawn to it and then they're affected by pesticides or other potential problems? What's that kind of landscape in and of itself look like?
Yeah, that's a very important issue, and it's really one of the primary motivations for writing the article. So we know that pesticides are being used heavily in these landscapes, and there can be a lot of ways that bees and other pollinators are exposed to them in the landscape, even if farmers are not directly applying pesticides to prairie strips, which is not happening. So in some ways, they're a refuge. But yes, through the soil, through drift in the air, there can be pesticides present in these habitats. And so it's very important to study both the potential costs and the benefits. And then the idea that we were exploring in the article was, can we get some idea of the net benefit? So is there a net benefit in spite of some of the costs that would be associated with being exposed to insecticides? So there have been numerous studies in prairie strips that have looked at movement of different types of pesticides, for example, neonicotinoid insecticides, which are used widely in these landscapes and known to have negative impacts on bees and other pollinators, and actually gone in and quantified those levels. And so we can summarize those results, but one of the key points that I want to drive home, even without thinking about specifically like what are the levels of pesticides, is just returning back to the landscape. So what other option are pollinators going to have in the landscape? Usually the only other option that's present, and we provide some maps in the article that sort of shows the extent of this, is going to be these field edges and habitats that are also adjacent to crop fields. And so comparisons between prairie strips and other areas that are immediately adjacent to crop fields show no difference in the levels of exposure of various different pesticides in prairie strips compared to, let's say, field edges. So the other options are equivalent in terms of the levels of pesticides that pollinators are likely to encounter. So that was a major thing in the paper. Maybe Matt can speak to some of the studies that have actually quantified the insecticides in prairie strips and interpreting those results.
Yeah, not to turn this back to you, James, but how frequently do you think insecticides are used in our corn and soybean fields of Iowa? How often do you think our farmers are spraying pesticides onto the crop?
My level of ignorance is actually interesting here because I have no idea, but I would imagine, I'm purely guessing, 3-4 times a season. I don't know.
Yeah. So for insecticides, it's maybe once a year that they are sprayed. Pretty much all the corn and most of the soybeans are treated with a neonicotinoid insecticide that's on the seed. And that can find its way into things like prairie strips, both when it's planted through the dust that is generated at planting. And then some of that moves through the subsurface of the soil as the seed coating wears off. And, that sediment that we're capturing in the prairie strip, some of that has neonicotinoid in it. But foliar applications of insecticides are maybe once a year. Typically, they're applied kind of late July, early August, often with the fungicide. But we're not applying 3-4 times a year like in other parts of the world, in part because Iowa just doesn't have the insect pest problems that you see further south and in the tropics. So that's not to say that we're not using them and that they're not an issue, but the intensity I don't think is as great as many perceive. Now, having said that, we have found residue of pesticides in the soils, in the plant tissue, and in the nectar and pollen of some plants that are found that are in the prairie strips. But the concentrations decline as you go from soil to plant tissue to nectar and pollen, as does the frequency of detection. So I think one of the points we make in the paper is this isn't quite like Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring, where there's this bioaccumulation, especially with neonicotinoids that are water soluble. They seem to be declining as you go from the soil up into the business end of the plant that pollinators are extracting resources. We've also found, and so the concentrations that we've seen and the frequencies, the EPA's models to estimate what the risk would be given the empirical evidence, and it comes out as low. So in a modeling space, it appears that the risk of a prairie strip functioning as an ecological trap is fairly low. And I think empirically our data suggests that we're not seeing evidence of that. When we put prairie strips in and allow them to establish over 3 years, which is the time at which it takes for those native perennial plants to build up the above ground biomass such that there are flowers, at that point we see improvements in abundance and diversity of native pollinators that we wouldn't see had those prairie strips not been there. So there's a concern for ecological trapping, but currently we don't see the evidence to support that. And so pulling back, and what's the big issue? Well, in Iowa, as I mentioned earlier, some 84 to 87% of our land is being used for agriculture. It's private land. And our colleagues who are concerned about monarch conservation have said, look, we need to practice conservation on that private land if we want to move the needle for monarch butterflies. So we need an all hands on deck approach to not just improve upon the public land, but also that private land. And so prairie strips become a practice that give access to private land for conservation for the bees that need that help.
Yeah, and one other thing to add about thinking about pesticide effects, I wanted to highlight some work by our collaborator on the project, Adam Dolezal, who actually tested levels of insecticides, sort of worst case scenario insecticide levels in a laboratory setting to see what the impacts on honeybees would be, using honeybees as a model. And they also integrated more of a real life type situation because often pesticides are interacting with other contexts, other factors in the environment, such as the availability of food and disease. And what they find is support for a broader theme in pollinator health, which applies not only to honeybees, but to wild species as well, is this idea of nutritional resilience. And so when bees have a good diet, they are more likely to be able to withstand these insecticides. And so one of the things that we think could be happening with prairie strips is because they're providing these great resources for pollinators across the entire season, not just in a short period of time, this can help them be physiologically healthier and then more likely to be able to withstand other stresses in the environment, such as pesticides and disease and things like that. So there is some evidence that, yes, there are insecticides, but by providing just a baseline better place to live, we can support the resilience of pollinators in the face of these sort of inevitable stressors that they're going to encounter in the environment, such as pesticides.
And it also sounds like, given the percentage of land that is privately owned and is used for agricultural purposes, this is the best available option anyway.
In many locations, that's true. So in no way do we want to detract from efforts to establish large reserves for wildlife conservation. Those are extremely important. But one of the messages that we try to drive home is that we need all hands on deck if we're to combat biodiversity loss, including pollinator declines. And prairie strips are an example of something that is a voluntary action that farmers can participate in and is clearly having some beneficial effects for pollinators. And so if we're going to be able to make a difference, this is an example of a program that could potentially help move the needle towards helping pollinators in a very difficult landscape.
And to pull back even further, the primary driver for the prairie strip, for the creation of the prairie strip practice, was addressing soil erosion, nutrient loss, and watershed health. And so as much as we're talking about and the benefit of this practice for pollinators and wildlife conservation, there are additional benefits that are co-occurring when farmers adopt this practice. And, we talked to our colleague, our co-author, Lisa Schulte-Moore, who talks to landowners often about the adopting this practice. And she reflects on, the value to farmers in conservation is conserving their soil and building that up, keeping it healthy. And prairie strips is a practice that can contribute to that. So this is all a way of saying it may not be the most perfect way to conserve pollinators in our landscape, but it's one that farmers are voluntarily adopting. And it's helping, in aggregate, address a lot of environmental issues that occur in our landscape. And that's a good thing. Could we do better? Sure. And maybe we will find that over time, if farmers adjust their pesticide use, that the benefits could be even more. But as it stands right now, I think it's notable, and that's kind of the point Amy and the other co-authors were trying to get through the paper, that, hey, even in our landscape, a little patch, these are 7 to 10 acres in fields that are often 500 acres. A little patch like that is making a noticeable difference. Shouldn't say noticeable, measurable. That's more empirical. That's more science sounding.
Right. And I find it, kind of particularly interesting, speaking in the One Health context in which this article will be published in BioScience, the notion of interconnectedness of various systems, both, the ecological systems, which is, of course, inclusive of the human system, and, everything else as well. I'm wondering about adoption and how much adoption we have seen so far, and then sort of following on from that, whether we might expect to see effects as a result of greater adoption, that is more interconnectedness potentially of, various prairie strip habitat locations and things like that.
I think there's two questions you're asking there. One is, what is the level of adoption, and what could happen if that goes up? So your listeners can be assured that if they Google or search for ISU and strips, they'll get something that's safe for work, our website, where the team keeps track of how many states the prairie strip CRP practice has been used and on how many acres. And spoiler alert, we're now at 14 states and over 26,000 acres of prairie. And that's in the context of that prairie being, like Amy said earlier, like what, 10% of the field? So that 10% is benefiting an order of magnitude more of acres for the. Amy, isn't this the topic of our next proposal?
It sure is. Yes, exactly.
As you increase the amount of prairie strips, does where it's placed and the surrounding landscape, does that matter?
Yeah, and one of the things that we're excited about is, can we envision a world in which there are enough patches of habitat such as prairie that if they're not physically connected, could they at least be sort of functionally connected, where pollinators and other wildlife could move between patches? And so, the more presence of these even tiny patches on the landscape, these could have large benefits when taken in aggregate over the scale of an entire landscape. So that is one sort of vision. And there are a few places that have kind of a lot of prairie strips already. They're sort of catching on in certain very localized regions within the Midwest. So if this is something that does continue to increase in adoption, which it is increasing, we might be able to see even more benefits than we're currently seeing with smaller isolated areas.
So one thing that's really cool about this system is how many and how big the patches are and how much of an impact depends upon what critter you're talking about. So there are some bees that forage fairly in a small area. They nest in the ground and they forage around that nest. There are other flower visiting insects, note I didn't say pollinators, flower visiting insects that disperse over a much larger area. The monarch butterfly. And so these patches could have an aggregate benefit, depending upon the meta-population dynamics for a given species, in such a way that even when they are fairly isolated, they could have a big impact as a refueling station, as a migrating monarch is making its way back down to Mexico. So it's not so simple to say, it would be great to put a bunch of these patches all in one place, because you might be missing out on a benefit for having a few isolated ones in those landscapes that are dominated by corn and soybeans.
That's fascinating. And so I feel like I've probably already stumbled into my future directions type of question already. But are there any other areas that you're looking at and excited about researching in the future? What are the kind of areas that are most interesting to you as things that it would be valuable to know more about?
Yeah. So not to give away all of our grant proposal ideas, but one of the things that we're also really interested in is something that you touched upon, James, which is really focusing in on some of the wild bees and getting more into the long-term success and population viability of some of these species. So we see more of them. If we go out and watch flowers, we see greater number of species, greater abundance. But how are they actually doing? And so one of the things that we're hoping to do is use certain species that are a little bit more amenable to tracking over time and actually look at survival and reproduction of numerous different species of wild bees, including some bumblebee species, some leafcutter bee species, for example, that are amenable to studying in more detail. So we have a lot of data for honeybees. We have some data for some wild bee species, but in Iowa, we estimate that we have 300 or so wild bee species. And we need more data on more species in order to understand how generally beneficial prairie strips are across a wide variety of species. A lot of them nest in the ground, and there is some concern there with pesticides that are used for neonicotinoid seed treatments, which are also in the ground. Potentially they're experiencing a different type of pesticide exposure than honeybees, which are not nesting in the ground. And so it's important to be able to study a wider variety of species.
I've got two things that I'm kind of excited about with regard to prairie strips and all the work we've been doing. One is pollinators aren't the only beneficial insect that reside in prairie strips. And we note this in the paper that, we've had some experiments where we've tracked what are called the natural enemies of insect pests that could be harbored, conserved in those prairie strips. And do they spill over into the crop and provide an additional ecosystem service of pest management? We've done some initial studies looking at significant pest of soybeans, the soybean aphid, and didn't see an effect. But we did see more natural enemies in the prairie strips, and some evidence that a few of them are spilling over. To what extent they're providing pest management for other insects and, say, weeds in the form of ground beetles that consume weed seeds, we still don't know the answers to that. So like to keep working in that space. And then the last one of the two is applying the lessons we've learned from the prairie strip practice to other settings. One of the lessons is, hey, if you put a little bit of native perennial flowering vegetation back into our landscapes, you're going to see some big impacts. And as we mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of private land that we're going to need to incorporate into these conservation programs if we want to have meaningful impact. And one place where that could happen is in the many solar farms that are being developed throughout the Midwest. And there's a growing practice called agrivoltaics, which is just farming under and around panels, and then ecovoltaics, practicing conservation under and around these panels. And we've started applying some of those lessons to a utility scale solar farm just south of campus, and we're seeing some remarkable changes. We saw a 400% increase in honeybee productivity when we took some of those lessons from the prairie strip and applied them to a solar farm. And we're also seeing native bees at those sites as well. So that partitioning or that sharing of the landscape that we saw in prairie strips, we're also seeing that in the solar farm. It'd be nice to see how robust that result could be across the dozens, maybe even hundreds of solar farms that are propping up all around the Midwest.
Yeah, and that raises just the question that we hope that our highlighting of prairie strips in a very detailed way provides some broader lessons about the potential for small habitat reconstructions and restorations in agricultural settings for biodiversity improvements. And there are a lot of similar type programs globally. Prairie is not present everywhere, but there are other programs in other geographical areas. Every one is unique and requires study, but at least we have a lot of data on both costs and benefits in prairie strips, and the overall message is promising. And so hopefully, similar efforts in other geographical regions and with other cropping systems can be providing further support for this hopeful message.
Great. Thank you very much. It's always nice to end on a hopeful note when you can get away with it. And I think that's very much the case here. And I think we have a lot to look out for in the future. This has been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James. This was fun.
Yeah.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.